Good afternoon, distinguished guests, esteemed faculty, colleagues, and students. It is with great privilege that I welcome you all to the 14th Professor Benjamin M. PULIMOOD Endowment Oration, organized by the Department of Internal Medicine and Infectious Disease, CMC Vellore. As we gather in this hall today, we honor not merely a name, but an ethos, an enduring commitment to clinical excellence, compassionate patient care, and the noble vocation of teaching. Let us prepare ourselves for an afternoon of reflection, learning, and celebration of what it means to serve in medicine. We commence this program by seeking divine guidance and blessings. I now invite the nursing staff from MTS 2 Ward to lead us in the prayer song. May we bow our hearts in reverence.
You have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. Every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Of your voice, you have led me through the fire in darkest night. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after me. With my life laid down, I'm surrendered now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Oh, I will sing of the goodness of God.
Thank you for that meaningful invocation. As we embark upon this academic gathering, let us invoke the blessings of the Almighty for wisdom and purpose. I kindly request Reverend Pearson to lead us in the opening prayer.
Good evening. Shall we bow our heads and look to God in prayer? Yes. Bless the Lord, O my soul, all that is within me, bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. Gracious God, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful evening where we could come together, and thank you for all the blessings that we have received. Thank you, O Lord, for the new opportunities, for us to learn new things and to educate ourselves. We want to thank you, Lord, for the delegates and the trainees and the team of faculty, people who have joined us from within the country and outside the country. Thank you, Lord, for the wonderful 2 weeks they had together. Lord, even as we come together, Lord, to give you thanks, Lord, we pray that you may be present in our midst and be glorified through all that we do. It's a prayer this evening, Lord, that all that we do will help us cater to the needs of the sick and suffering, wherever you take us to in different capacities. We ask all these things in the matchless name of Christ Jesus, our Lord. Amen. Yeah.
Thank you, Reverend Pearson. Every meaningful journey begins with a warm reception. I now invite Dr. Samuel Hanstack, Head of Department of Internal Medicine, to deliver the welcome address.
Respected Dr. Uday, representing the Directorate, Dr. Judy, representing the Principal's Office. We have Dr. Dilip Mathai, you can't miss him, and he's been the founder of infectious disease. Dr. Benjamin Pulimood's family members, we have Dr. Tony and the son-in-law and Dr. Dia, who could represent from the family. All the distinguished colleagues, faculty members, and students, on behalf of the Department of Medicine and Internal Medicine, it's my privilege to welcome you all for this year's Benjamin Pulimood oration. I want to thank the Department of Infectious Disease for organizing this oration. They always do all the hard work and give the credit to Department of Medicine. We don't complain, but really speaking, they worked hard for this, including finding the speaker and all the arrangements. I want to thank them. I know Dr. Pulimood will be talked about in details, but I just wanted to share an incident when I was working as a non-PG registrar in gastro department, and he was admitted for his annual checkup, and all the department people pushed me as a non-PG registrar, go take a history, and they wouldn't go and take a history because he was quite a senior person there. So when I went into the room to take a history, for the next 30 minutes, he was taking my history, who am I, where I came from, and everything that he could find out. Then I started my history. The next day, he had to go for his test. A wheelchair was ready. He refused to walk. Refused to get in the wheelchair. He decided to walk. And I think that was the longest journey I ever made from the ward to the place of his test, because he knew so many people. He knew the staff. He knew their children, what they were doing it. And he knew what they were applying for in terms of their future career. And I was amazed at him. He, being the director, the principal, still was so touched on the grounds with the people, was really amazing. And I'm sure we'll hear more about him. He spent his time visiting mission hospitals when many of us go to overseas for our study leave and sabbatical leave. He spent time spending time with his students, something that really was really touching. So I feel he was a person and as a professional. Within that framework, he has left a legacy for each one of us, and something that we keep reminding ourselves to say, as much as sometimes we pursue the professionalism, or we either pursue people-oriented and forget the professionalism. It's a challenge to manage both of them, and that is something I think Dr. Benjamin Pulimood has left for us. HIV remains one of the defining public health challenges in low and middle income countries. LMICs carry nearly 70% of the global HIV burden, yet they have also demonstrated remarkable achievement scaling up ARTs, integrating HIV, TB care, and drastically reducing mortality. Despite this progress, there are unique challenges facing LMIC's countries, and we have among us Professor Graham Menkes, who will be sharing with us the journey of HIV and ART in low and medium income countries. I'm sure he'll also be hearing the story of resilience, justice, and innovation. So, with great joy and gratitude, I welcome you all for this year's Benjamin PULIMOOD oration. Thank you all for joining us. I want to also welcome all our online viewers. Many of them have joined from different places. We want to welcome you also. Thank you for joining us, and may today's session enrich our understanding and strengthen our commitment to compassionate, evidence-based care. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. We shall now proceed with the traditional lamp lighting ceremony, a symbol of illumination and pursuit of knowledge. I request our dignitaries, Associate Director Dr. Uday Zakaria, Vice Principal Dr. Judy, Dr. Ramya, Professor of Internal Medicine, Dr. Priscilla, HOD of Infectious Diseases, and Professor Graham Menkes to kindly come forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Benjamin Matthew PULIMOOD was a physician of rare distinction whose career at CMC Vellore spanned 37 remarkable years. I now invite Dr. Kripa George, Associate Professor, Department of Internal Medicine, to reflect upon this extraordinary legacy.
Dr. PULIMOOD completed his MBBS in 1957 from Trivandrum Medical College and joined Christian Medical College, Vellore the same year. He obtained his MRCP in 1962 and had the FRCP conferred on him in 1973. He continued his dutiful and dedicated service to the institution for 37 years and became one of the first faculties to have completed a lifetime of service in the Department of Medicine prior to his superannuation in 1995. He was the head of the Department of Medicine 1 for many years and head of the entire Department of Medicine for many years subsequently. He was a consummate clinician and teacher and has trained some of the best clinicians today. During his tenure as the head of the Department of Medicine, He encouraged the growth and subsequently the branching of specialties like cardiology, gastroenterology, hematology, and now infectious diseases. He was the 11th principal of CMC Vellore and consistently encouraged the achievement of academic excellence. He supported faculty in their efforts to further personal goals of path-breaking research or clinical training and thus contribute to the institution's mandate of socially relevant academic excellence. His committed effort to ensure that sponsored candidates fulfilled their bond obligations ensured continued strengthening and development of peripheral mission hospitals. At this time, he became the founder president of Christian Colleges of Medicine in Asia. He was the 8th director of CMC Vellore from 1987 to 1994. The phenomenal growth and rise of the institution with him at the helm promoted the cause of education, improvement in patient amenities and services, optimization and initiation of new technological advances, at the same time ensuring fulfillment of the community's needs with low cost effective care. He built relationships through his simplicity, spiritual and humane values, with a strong sense of personal ethics. The strong administrative and financial discipline he exercised enabled the rapid growth of the institution. The fame CMC has achieved today is indeed a tribute to his far-reaching vision. He was honored with the Alumni Award of Distinction for faithfully and firmly fulfilling his stewardship role and inspiring countless alumni to uphold the ideals of the institution. I would now like to call Dr. Dilip Mathai, former head of the Department of Medicine, to also say a few words about Dr. PULIMOOD and the oration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was so kind of you to invite me for this function, but so very unkind of you to make me speak without notice, hardly 1 minute notice. And I would say that you mentioned two important years. 1957, Dr. PULIMOOD joined here. I was born in 1952. He was in 1957, so he was my senior. He retired in 1995, and I became his boss in 1995. In other words, I learned a lot from him. What we have done for him is a very small token of our appreciation in creating this Dr. Benjamin M. PULIMOOD oration. Well, I can only sum up his characteristics in 3 words. 1, he had a lot of common sense. 2, he was, sorry, okay. 2, he practiced Christian ethos, and he also had a lot of empathy. And I would like to say that he is a very good clinician, but not from the textbook point of view. You cannot learn empathy from any textbook, but you learned empathy from him. You learned bedside manners from him. His involvement with doctor-patient relationship, you learned from him. What I am today is because of him. Now, why I'm saying this is we have to look at certain role models in our life to live your own life. I try to live his, follow his footsteps, but nowhere near in what he has achieved. What I need to say is, yes, he had a lot of entrepreneurial zeal, and he allowed you as a youngster to play around with whatever you wanted to do, and he helped us reach our own academic career that we decided for ourselves. I had no intention of continuing my life and service here in CMC. I wanted to run away after 3 years. After I completed my 3 years mission bond, I went to the principal's office and told him, "Sir, thank you very much for all that you have done for me." I said, "No." And then I said, why have you come here to tell me this? "Sir, I finished my bond obligations. I would now to leave." "You can never leave this place. You are always bonded until death do ye part." And here I stand. Thank you very much for this privilege of speaking about my health.
Thank you, sir and ma'am, for illuminating the origins and significance of this oration. We are honored to have with us the leadership in this institution who embody the values that Professor PULIMOOD championed. I now invite the following dignitaries to offer their felicitation: Associate Director Dr. Uday Zachariah, Vice Principal Dr. Judy, and Dr. Ramya, Professor of Medicine.
Good evening, friends. On behalf of our director, Dr. Vikram Matthews, and the directorate, I bring you greetings. I want to thank the Department of Medicine and Infectious Disease for organizing this beautiful oration consistently, and this is the 14th year that we've been doing so. I note that there is presence from the PULIMOOD family here, as has been there in the past. And I want to highlight that while we speak of Dr. Benjamin PULIMOOD, the immediate family and extended family, the PULIMOOD family, has contributed 3 generations of people to the growth of this institution. And as we celebrate the 125th year, and today is the Hospital Day celebrations going on simultaneously, I want to thank, on behalf of the directorate, the PULIMOOD family. Also want to thank Professor Graham Menkes for having made the journey here and to enlighten us with your expertise. On a lighter note, we are even because we won the women's and you all won the men's round of cricket. And so we look forward to the rest of your talk. Thank you so much for having given me this opportunity.
Good evening, dear friends and dignitaries who are here, as well as those who are there virtually. I'm here on behalf of Dr. Solomon, our principal, who couldn't be here, but really an honor. Dr. Benjamin was a director when I joined medicine. Dr. Dilip Patai was my teacher when I was studying. So truly a reminder yet again that, there is a calling that each one of us have been given. And CMC is about how God calls us, and whatever challenge is there, we respond because of that calling that God has put in our heart. And very, very close to the heart of the work that was started is that compassionate heart which drives us, whether it is a challenge of HIV or infectious diseases. We know the challenges have increased, multiplied, but that compassionate high heart which drives us to learn, to train, to give off. Like how Dr. Dilip Mathai said, the role model that he had was Dr. Benjamin, and you can see that many of us used to admire Dr. Dilip Mathai. When every patient came in, he knew the details about that patient. So, those lights and those continued to be handed over from one generation to the other. So we're really grateful because of the institution that has been so magnanimous and the giants who have gone before us, because of which we know that the light continues to shine. And we don't know the answers to many questions, but that freedom that has been given to teach, to train, to seek, to research. And it's like a battle that we're not fighting alone. We're fighting, and God is enabling us through our trainees, our students, and as a community. So even when we are discussing today, how do you meet this challenge of the work? It is because we work together as a team, the nurses, the doctors, the therapists, and really want to congratulate Dr. Priscilla, the Department of Infectious Diseases, Medicine, as we work alongside together. And I'm sure this oration is yet another moment to share the journey of work that has happened in HIV and across countries, across nations. This work continues, and I'm sure it'll be a very enriching experience to be able to listen from the oration how the work is that is being done is continuing to change the scenario. I mean, we've also been the first one of the centers doing a unique work with HIV, ART, and so congratulations on this moment of sharing the journey that we are going to hear now, and look forward to the excellent work that is going to be impacted through the work that has been happening through infectious diseases. Thank you.
A very good afternoon to all my dear colleagues and friends who have gathered here. It's my honor to felicitate Dr. Graham Menkes on behalf of the Department of Medicine. Dr. Menkes, I have been keenly reading his work very furiously over the last 1 week, and I have realized that it's not possible to complete reading your work. And so I realized you're a professor of infectious disease and clinical scientist. He's an accomplished researcher and a deputy head of medicine in the University of Cape Town and clinical professor in infectious disease in Queen Mary's University. He has a chair in SARCHI, South African Research for Poverty-Related Infections. He's a clinical scientist combining frontline patient care with high-impact clinical research. As I was reading through his work, what I found extremely fascinating is that as a clinical scientist, he took up areas which are totally neglected all around the world. Diseases of poverty and areas that are truly difficult to research in, such as immune reconstitution syndrome, and areas that are lagging behind in research, such as TB diagnostics. So I was going through his study on diagnosing TB through tests in the urine, and I found it very interesting, and so much lateral thinking had gone into that study. His work in these areas is not described, he's not only described these conditions in detail, but has presented practical evidence-based strategies to combat diseases which have saved countless lives. He has played a crucial role in developing definition of IRIS, immune reconstitution syndrome, and also understanding of the pathogenesis of IRIS by looking at HLA genes and their role they play in IRIS. His work has led to the development of national, international, and WHO standardized guidelines in the management of IRIS and cryptococcal meningitis. He's conducted many pioneering studies. It was very fascinating to see in 2010s that you had done a RCT on steroids, use of steroids for IRIS. I think that's total lateral thinking, and also in severe cryptococcal meningitis. Nobody will think of using steroids for an infection. And I was really fascinated by your work, sir. And yes, you've been awarded the Rising Star of Africa in 2013. I saw that, and the Scientific Leadership Prize from European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials in 2020. And you've got major scientific recognition and merit prizes because of the scientific rigor which is presented in your work. Beyond research, I see that you're a dedicated teacher and a mentor because you've mentored a lot of PhD students from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and in diseases such as HIV, TB, and other infections. So what I found out that your colleagues have described you as very generous with your time because you helped them with the PhD and you mentored them and handheld them throughout their work. And also you, through your clinical work, they have said that you're very compassionate, you're very meticulous attention to detail, and your unwavering advocacy for people who are in poverty suffering from very severe illnesses. Today's felicitation is a tribute to your pioneering scientific career, which is grounded in service, curiosity, and relentless drive to reduce suffering among the vulnerable communities suffering not only from poverty but severe medical illnesses. Professor Menkes has shown rigorous science and humane care can go hand in hand. So you're a true clinical scientist. And that excellence in medicine is measured through lives improved and the futures which have been restored. On behalf of everyone gathered here in the Department of Medicine, I offer my heartiest congratulations to you, sir, for the Benjamin PULIMOOD oration. And with deep gratitude to your past contributions, and I'm in great anticipation to listening to your talk and your future achievements. And I also wanted to say that recently South Africa seems to have taken over India, with Tembo Bauma, and now we are waiting to, we are waiting for you to win over our hearts. Thank you so much.
Thank you for those gracious words of encouragement and institutional support. This oration has over the years brought distinguished physicians and researchers to this podium. individuals who exemplify the spirit of inquiry and service in infectious diseases. Today, we are privileged to host an orator whose work has transformed the care of patients living with HIV across the African continent and whose research has shaped international guidelines. I now invite Dr. Priscilla Rupali, Head of Department of Infectious Diseases, to introduce our distinguished orator.
Thank you, Anupa. A lot of my work has already been done by Ramya. Dr. Graham's biography is at the back, but I'm going to share a little bit about what we as a department from Medicine One, and then we came on to ID. So I was a Medicine One intern. Dr. Dilip was my boss, and I still remember this was 1991. I'm sure most of you were not born, but so I still remember that was the time when I was called as a Medicine One intern to take blood in a HIV patient in the gynae ward. So I remember thinking, why am I being called? Like, I'm at the same risk as anybody else. But somehow, because we were the only department which dealt with HIV, I was asked to go and take blood. So I went ahead and took blood and whatever and came back. And subsequently, I joined Medicine One as a non-PG registrar, just in between, my period of bond and my MD medicine, and I did some work on HIV there as well. And then, of course, I joined Medicine One after that. So as you can see, it's really been Medicine One. What I'd really like to say is we've progressed so much. HIV is one disease that has actually been transformed from a disease which was a killer disease to a disease which is a chronic disease. No other disease has made such strides. So I've been trying to get Dr. Graham Menkes for a long time. We've been stalking him because when we were actually struggling with iris, I still remember we would faithfully, I had all the INSHI definitions memorized because we really were struggling with all these things. And it was such a wonderful thing to see all the definitions. Now, if you ask my DMP postgraduates, they would not even know what INSHI is. But that's why I was asking Graham, has it stopped? Is it still ongoing? The network, I believe, has been dissolved. So INSHI was what was the International Network for Study in HIV-associated iris. And now people don't recognize iris and they tend to miss it because, you don't really know the definitions that were there. Dr. Menkes' work has been crucial and instrumental for us actually being able to recognize what these, diseases were, to be able to appropriately manage it. And those days when there was so much fear and stigma, we were one of the departments which were dealing with these patients all the time. And we used to look forward to all these articles coming out and say, oh, wow, okay, this has come. Let's see it. How can we apply it into our practice? So we've come a long way. And, we've been stalking him. We've been stalking Bob Coldblutters, all these people who were stalwarts in managing HIV. So really grateful that he agreed. I had to ask him, I think, 3 years in a row till he got fed up and said, okay, I'm coming. Okay. So I'm really grateful. We've been talking you so much. I actually learned how to pronounce your name, so which is difficult. So Professor Graham, we're really honored to have you here. We're privileged, and it's your work really inspires all of us. We look forward to your work because a lot of what you do directly influences and impacts what we do in our country as well. Many of the questions that are unanswered continue to be answered by the various clinical trials that you do. So we're really grateful that you're here. And I think all of us in our department, we've been in awe of your lectures, your bedside sessions, and we're really privileged to have you here. So over to you.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much, Dr. Ramya and Priscilla, for that very kind introduction. It's really fantastic to be here. And thanks to the Department of Medicine and the Department of Infectious Diseases for inviting me to give this lecture. And Priscilla asked me to speak on the journey of HIV and ART in low and middle income countries. And given that most of my work has been done in South Africa and in collaboration with other African countries, this is mostly a perspective on HIV and ART scale up in Africa. But obviously many of the issues are going to overlap with the issues in India. So to start out with, just to say that it's been a real privilege to hear about the life and the work of Professor PULIMOOD and just what he did as a doctor in terms of medical care, as a medical scientist, as a teacher, and clearly from what we've heard this afternoon, a respected leader in healthcare and a mentor whose legacy lives on. And so for me, it's really a great honor to be asked to give this lecture in honor of this man. So when Priscilla asked me to tell about the journey of HIV and ART, I thought that it's really a story that needs to be told this afternoon. The story, which is a long and winding road with many challenges along the way. But as Priscilla referred to in her introduction, really huge achievements in the field of HIV. So despite the challenges and the impediments along the way, there have been enormous strides made, but we still face challenges, and I'm going to highlight some of those towards the end of the talk. This is the Sani Pass that separates Lesotho, country landlocked within South Africa, and the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. And those are probably two of the regions that are most affected by the HIV epidemic in the whole world. So the journey of HIV and ART that I want to speak about this afternoon is start back at the origins of HIV, then describe the march of death that occurred across Africa before we had access to therapy, the scientific breakthroughs that occurred that remained beyond the reach of low and middle income countries initially, and the global battle that really occurred to ensure access and equity. And then the remarkable public health achievements that have been made and the simplifications and the improvements in treatment that we've seen over the last 2 decades, but the challenges that we still face and some of the potential solutions. So to start the story right at the beginning, from some really elegant scientific work done in Central Africa, in Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's been established that the origins of HIV were from simian immunodeficiency virus, and that there were a number of transmission events that probably happened in the early 1900s of transmissions of SIV from old world monkeys to the great apes, as well as to humans. For instance, the pseudomangabe SIV was transmitted to humans and gave rise to HIV-2 that largely remained confined to West Africa. But it was probably based on phylogenetic analysis, a single transmission event of SIV from the chimpanzee to a human in Cameroon in the early 1900s that gave rise to HIV-1 group M, which is the virus responsible for the global epidemic that we see today. And that transmission and the subsequent cases of HIV remained largely confined to Central Africa for decades at low endemic levels and was not recognized as a unique disease. But it crossed the Atlantic to the Americas, probably it's a decade or two before it was first recognized, and probably there was a widespread spread of HIV in the 1970s in the United States. But it was only in the early 1980s that a cluster of cases of pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi sarcoma in gay men in Los Angeles who were previously well and had no known cause of immune deficiency that gave rise to an investigation by the CDC task force And this was published in the MMRW in mid-1981 and gave rise to the recognition that we were dealing with a new disease, an intense scientific investigation. And this led within 2 years to the isolation of HIV virus by Françoise Barré-Senoussi and Luc Montagnier in France, isolated from the lymph node of a patient with AIDS, as well as by Robert Gallo in the United States. And the 2 French researchers received the Nobel Prize subsequently for it. It then became apparent that the hallmark of untreated HIV infection was infection predominantly of CD4 T lymphocytes and depletion of CD4 T lymphocytes progressively during the years of HIV infection that led to immunosuppression and opportunistic infections. So before the advent of antiretroviral therapy, what the picture that we saw of people with HIV infection was relentless progression from the infection to AIDS within 5 to 10 years. And once patients developed AIDS, we could treat the opportunistic infections, but nonetheless, their immunodeficiency continued to progress. And most patients died within 1 to 2 years of developing an AIDS diagnosis. Common causes of death in Africa were TB, bacterial infections, chronic diarrhea, cryptococcal meningitis, and Kaposi's sarcoma. And the first real wave of the epidemic in terms of deaths occurred in the United States in the 1980s. And it affected gay men, hemophiliacs who received blood transfusions, people who injected drugs, as well as many people, heterosexual people. And it was estimated that around 100,000 people died in the 1980s in the United States. And this is just a picture from the National Mall in Washington showing the quilts that each commemorate a life of somebody who died from HIV. But during the 1980s, Africa was relatively less affected by HIV. So if you look at these maps, the first one on the left at top, 1984, you can see that the proportion of people with HIV in most countries was less than 1%. And then by 1989, at the top right, you can see already East African countries were the first to be infected. So it was thought that it was re-imported from the Americas to East Africa. And East countries like Uganda were first affected, and it came down Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe. And you can see in 1989, South Africa was still relatively spared from HIV. And that's because of the apartheid policies of the previous government, and that there wasn't much communication between South Africa and other African countries at that stage. But obviously that changed in the 1990s. And by 1994, you can see that the whole of East and Southern Africa, as well as countries in West Africa, are affected by HIV, and a much worse picture by 1999. And it's thought that the transport routes, the trucking routes down Africa, were what spread the disease from East to Southern Africa. And this just represents the data with respect to the increase in the number of new infections in Africa from 1980 through to 1999. So during that 20-year period, you can see 1980, almost no new infections in Africa. But by 1999, 4 million new infections occurring per year in Africa. And if we look at South Africa, as I said to you, by early 1990, HIV was hardly present in South Africa. And this is data that was published in 2001, both showing data up to that point and then projections subsequent to that point, which turned out to be largely true. And what you see is that I just want you to focus on the light blue line, which is people aged 30 to 34, where the prevalence of HIV in 1990 was 0. And it was estimated at that point that by 2005, 30%, so 1 in 3 people of the age in the early 30s would be HIV infected. And that's exactly what it turned out, that among women attending for antenatal care in South Africa in the mid-2000s, 1 in 3 young women was HIV infected. And of course, that was the march of the epidemic through the 1980s and the 1990s. And we were only able to turn around the epidemic and the consequences of the epidemic because of scientific breakthroughs. And that major breakthrough occurred in the late 1990s with the advent of triple antiretroviral therapy to treat HIV. We first got AZT monotherapy that was repurposed from cancer treatment in the late 1980s. But if you look at the graphs, what it's showing is the drop of HIV viral load that occurred on antiretroviral therapy and subsequent rebound due to resistance. So with AZT, you got about a 1 log drop on average, but within a few months, the viral load returned to what it was because of a resistance developing. With two drugs, you got a more potent suppression of viral load, but again, resistance developed in most people, and there was a rebound of the viral load. And it was only with triple therapy in the 1990s that you suddenly saw a substantial reduction in viral load of several log, and that was sustained if patients took it with good adherence and could remain suppressed for months and subsequently we know for years and decades. And that has really enabled us to turn around the consequences of HIV. And you can just see in 1997, Dr. David Ho from New York was named Time Man of the Year for his discovery of the fact that there was a huge replication of HIV going on. Somebody was infected. And that really was the fundamental breakthrough that led to the understanding that you could suppress HIV with drugs. So we've obviously come a long way with antiretroviral therapy. We now have many classes of drugs that suppress viral replication. In the 1990s, we had a nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors and protease inhibitors. Subsequently, we had non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors. We've subsequently developed integrase inhibitors, and I'll speak more about that later, as well as many drugs that work on entry of HIV into the CD4 cell, and by inhibiting multiple steps in HIV replication, able to potently suppress HIV replication and maintain the viral load below the limit of detection for years. So when somebody starts antiretroviral therapy, we see the viral load going down. Over 90% of patients with good adherence will achieve suppression within 3 to 6 months. And that allows the CD4 count to recover. If you start antiretrovirals early, obviously it maintains the CD4 count in the normal range. But if the patient starts HIV therapy late, that leads to CD4 count recovery by about 75 cells in the first month, and then about 75 cells per year. And most people, about 80% of people, even if they start with advanced immunosuppression, will achieve a normal CD4 count after several years of therapy. And so what this converted to in terms of the impact on an epidemiological level, and this is from the cohort study, the HOP study in the United States, between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s, is it essentially led to a dramatic reduction in hospitalizations for HIV-related opportunistic infections. And you can see here shown for 4 of the top opportunistic infections in the United States at that time, just this dramatic reduction as triple therapy became available to much lower levels. And clinicians from who were working in the United States speak about that time being when they had large AIDS wards, and within 2 to 3 years, there were very few admissions to those wards compared to the full wards that they had in the early 1990s. But despite that progress, that scientific progress, those huge breakthroughs, the frustration was that was not being made available and not realized in low and middle income countries. And so, as I told you, the triple therapy the breakthrough was made in the mid 1990s. But by 2000, there was still 1.5 to 2.5 million people dying in Africa of HIV in that year. The cost of triple therapy in 2000 was around $10,000 per year, which was completely unaffordable to African health systems, and really just spoke to an injustice in global health, the fact that people were dying despite a scientific breakthrough. The patents were still owned by the originator drug companies, and it prevented the production of generic equivalents. And there was a perception and a prejudice, and one can say a racism from many high-income country policy makers, that ART could not be feasibly implemented in Africa. There was a US government official that made a statement about that Africans wouldn't be able to keep the time and therefore remain adherent to their complex therapy. And so I think it was both financial barriers as well as barriers of prejudice that initially prevented the scale up of ART in low and middle income countries. And as I said, starkly highlighted global health inequalities. But the real turning point for the global fight against HIV was the AIDS conference that was held in Durban in 2000 in South Africa. And really, there was huge advocacy. And this conference was a seminal moment in highlighting the gross inequality in global health, that you had a scientific breakthrough that was being held back due to financial reasons from people in Africa and other low and middle income settings. And Nelson Mandela, who was at that stage our ex-president, but still was very vocal in the fight against HIV, gave the closing address at this conference. And he said, "Let us not equivocate. A tragedy of unprecedented proportions is unfolding in Africa. AIDS today in Africa is claiming more lives than the sum total of all wars, famines, and floods, and the ravages of such deadly diseases as malaria. It is devastating families and communities. And we're seeing a huge number of children being orphaned due to HIV, overwhelming and depleting healthcare services and robbing schools of both students and teachers." And that conference and that moment really provided the impetus and the momentum for a huge global commitment from high-income countries to help turn around the tide of deaths due to HIV in Africa and other LMIC settings. And as I said, it set off a process internationally to make HIV treatment available. And that involved reductions in drug costs, the generic manufacture of antiretroviral therapy, and the formation of the Global Fund in 2002, with pledges from many high-income countries to support treatments and prevention for these diseases in low and middle-income countries. The WHO HIV department, Jim Kim was the head at that stage, announced the 3x5 initiative in 2003. And the aim of that was to get 3 million people on antiretroviral therapy by the year 2005. And that was a really spearheaded a public health initiative. It was an ambitious plan. I can still remember hearing about it. It sounded over-ambitious, but it really sparked action from across the world to make this happen. And it was eventually achieved in 2007 that 3 million people were on antiretroviral therapy in low and middle income countries. And obviously a huge commitment from the United States government in 2003 with the launch of PEPFAR that has invested over $100 billion over 2 decades to fighting diseases, including HIV, in low and middle income countries, and has contributed to saving 25 million lives. And so this, again, as we saw in the United States, in African countries, immediately started converting into reductions in morbidity and mortality due to HIV. And this is a study from Malawi where they don't do death registrations. And so they couldn't go to the death registers to see the mortality reduction. So what the researchers did is they went to the coffin producers, and they said, "Can we see your account books for the last 7 years?" And they were able to track the reduction in the sales of coffins. And you can see this massive reduction in coffin sales in Malawi as a result of the scale up of antiretroviral therapy. But obviously, pictures speak a lot louder than words and statistics. And this is an image that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2006 from the Partners in Health program in Haiti, of a man who was dying of HIV, and you can see him in his hospital bed there. And the image of him on the right-hand side is just 6 months later. responding to antiretroviral therapy. And, having been a young clinician working in the wards in South Africa, at that stage, we saw so many patients like this who had waited for years, and just many of their compatriots had died of HIV, and they were lucky to survive with advanced AIDS. And then they got access to antiretroviral therapy, and literally it was like a Lazarus effect that people from that state were returned to health and function within their families and their communities. Obviously, some patients, it came too late, and there were still deaths that occurred despite antiretroviral therapy, but we saw so many patients like this. But there were early challenges for our ART programs in low and middle income countries, and Priscilla's referred to some of them. One of them was the large pill burden of antiretroviral therapy. We didn't have fixed dose combinations, so patients had to take multiple, often complex regimens, particularly if there were protease inhibitors with restrictions about when they could take them in relation to food. And then they were taking treatment for their opportunistic infections and cotrimoxazole, and it was a high pill burden. There was the toxicity of the drugs that I'll speak to next. As I said, many patients started with advanced HIV, and the drugs really just came too late. And so there were still high mortality rates during early antiretroviral therapy, and some of them that was driven by IRIS. So just to speak of one of the early side effects that we had to deal with, one of the drugs that we were forced to use because it was the cheapest available at that stage was a drug Stavudine, or D4T, that was a potent mitochondrial toxin. And patients developed terrible, painful peripheral neuropathies, but also the life-threatening side effect of lactic acidosis. And this was a publication that we put out in the 2000s of our experience of lactic acidosis at our hospital in Cape Town, where the inpatient mortality, despite supportive therapy, was 16%. And reports like this and other reports from around the world helped us to motivate for moving away from Stavudine to a safer drug in tenofovir. And obviously, there's other innovations in the program, like moving away from nevirapine with its hypersensitivity reactions in hepatitis, to efavirenz with its problems in terms of CNS side effects, subsequently to dolutegravir. That's a theme that I'll come to, is that we haven't just stuck with the same thing. There's continuous innovations and improvements that have occurred over the last 2 decades. And then, of course, we had, with starting so many patients with advanced HIV on antiretroviral therapy, we had to encounter IRIS. And when I first started the ARV clinic, we were encountering clinical presentations that had not been reported in the literature. We couldn't go to the textbooks. We had to systematically document what we were seeing, communicate with other researchers, like in the INCHI network, that Priscilla was referring to, and write up these cases and try to make sense of what was happening. And so there are just 2 examples: a patient with terrible cervical lymphadenitis due to TB IRIS, and a young woman that died in our care with a fatal tuberculoma enlargement due to IRIS. And we performed a clinical trial to show that prednisone was both effective at shortening the duration of IRIS and was safe in patients with advanced HIV who had developed TB IRIS. And that was published in 2010. We subsequently also performed a trial there from 2013 to 2016, showing that prednisone could be used as effective prophylaxis for TB, to prevent TB IRIS in high-risk patients with HIV and TB starting antiretroviral therapy. So patients with a CD4 count of less than 100 with TB starting ART, giving them a fairly moderate dose of prednisone reduced the risk of developing IRIS by 30%. And among those who did develop IRIS despite the prednisone, they had less severe manifestations of IRIS. And so that has informed international guidelines with respect to the management of patients with HIV-TB. But one of the issues with respect to the early introduction of antiretroviral therapy in low and middle income countries was that we had a threshold for starting antiretroviral therapy that really sounds crazy today. We waited till patients had a CD4 count of less than 200 or had a WHO stage 4 defining condition. And if they had that, then they were eligible. If they had a CD4 count of 210, they were told to come back for a CD4 count in 6 months' time. And so, many patients died with that policy in place, but it really was necessary at that time because there were so many patients who required antiretroviral therapy. There had to be some way of triaging the introduction of antiretroviral therapy. But the guidelines progressively shifted from that 200 threshold to 350. And then these two seminal trials that were published in 2015 really informed the way we practice today. The START trial and the Temprano trial provided evidence that we should start ART soon after HIV diagnosis. And the START trial compared starting ART at the time of diagnosis to waiting to a CD4 count threshold of 350 and showed that if starting ART immediately reduced the primary endpoint of serious AIDS, non-AIDS events and death. And it led to the WHO policy change, implementation of test and treat, including offering ART on the same day as HIV diagnosis. And so what's happened since the early 2000s that we got access to antiretroviral therapy in low and middle income countries. By 2010, there were about 7 million people on antiretroviral therapy. And you can see that that's progressively gone up. And it's estimated that today there's around 31 million people on antiretroviral therapy across the world, the majority in low and middle income countries. And that's led to a decline in HIV-related deaths from a peak of around 2 million in 2005. And then this progressive decline, but worryingly a plateau in the last few years at around 600,000. And I'll come back to that later in the talk. And what we've seen in terms of life expectancy, and this is just showing you 3 of the countries that have been most severely affected by HIV, all in Southern Africa, Botswana, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. And you can see that prior to the 1990s, there was, due to socioeconomic improvements and healthcare improvements, progressive improvements in life expectancy. And there's then this precipitous drop by about 10 years. And this is not just for people with HIV, this is across the whole population, drop in life expectancy by about 10 years through to the mid-2000s. And then you see with the introduction of antiretroviral therapy, returning to the same trajectory. So it really has turned around the drop in life expectancy and the impacts in that regard. If I just reflect on my own country, the HIV epidemic in South Africa, the data between 2000 and 2024. In 2000, there were 3.5 million people living with HIV. Currently, there's close on 8 million people living with HIV. Obviously, that is in part a success because there are more people living and not dying with HIV. People on antiretroviral therapy in our public sector, there were none in 2000. There are now over 6 million people on antiretroviral therapy. New infections have dropped from around 500,000 to 170,000 a year. And HIV-related deaths have dropped. The peak was in 2005 at about 1/3 of a million and has dropped to 53,000. And there's been dramatic improvements in life expectancy. So this is a study published in 2016 that really reported at that stage, based on modeling and the data that they had from South Africa, that patients starting with a CD4 count of around 200, men on the left and women on the right, compared to HIV negatives in the dark gray bars, life expectancy was around 80% of the HIV negatives. And it's continued. If you think that at that point we were waiting for a threshold to start ARVs, and now we're starting a lot earlier, life expectancy is very close now, within 5 years of HIV negative people, if patients take the therapy with good adherence. And this is a slide that I showed 2 days ago on the course, but I wanted to show it again today, just to show a remarkable thing, the impact that the scale-up of antiretroviral therapy to treat HIV has had on the TB epidemic in South Africa. So treating one infection has indirectly had a huge impact on another infection. So I'll take you through this graph between 1990 and 2020. as a 30-year period. And what you see is if you focus on the red line is the HIV prevalence in the adult population in South Africa, which increased from 0%, as I told you, to about 18% by 2020, 18% of the adult population having HIV. Then as a result of the spread of HIV, the negative impacts on the TB epidemic in terms of incidence in the light blue line, and TB deaths in the orange line increasing through to the mid-2000s. And then in the purple line, you can see the introduction of antiretroviral therapy at scale. We now have 75% of people with HIV on antiretroviral therapy. You see the TB epidemic coming down. And this takes you out to 2020, but if you look out to last year, we've returned to the 1990 prevalence incidence of TB. And so that really antiretroviral therapy has positively impacted our TB epidemic. And this is just, if we reflect on the stats that came out this week from UNAIDS, the current state of the global TB epidemic, it's now estimated that 41 million people are living with HIV across the world, 1.3 million newly infected each year. As I've told you, around 600,000 people die each year from HIV. It's estimated that around 75% are on antiretroviral therapy, close to 32 million people. And that over the course of the epidemic, 91 million people have been infected with HIV and 44 million people have died from AIDS-related disease since the start of the epidemic. And obviously, the epidemic still remains the greatest effects of HIV and the greatest burden is still within Africa, and particularly within the countries of Southern Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, in the very dark red there. 65% of all people living with HIV live in Africa. And the UNAIDS, as most of you will know, has set ambitious targets in terms of HIV treatment to help us attain epidemic control. And the goal is that 95% of people should know their HIV status, 95% of those people should be on antiretroviral therapy, and 95% of people on therapy should have a suppressed viral load. And this is the most recent data in terms of global progress towards the 1995 goals. And you see globally it's 87% know their status, 89% of them are on therapy, and 94% on therapy have a suppressed viral load. And you can see, I think one point to highlight here is that some regions of the world are doing better than others. And, you know, that's a cause for concern, particularly with respect to people knowing their HIV diagnosis. We just focus in Asia, only 79% of people know their diagnosis. And obviously that's a barrier to achieving the goal. So I next want to move on to discussing a really important breakthrough that has happened within the last few years, and that's the scale-up of TLD, which stands for tenofovir, lamivudine, and dolutegravir, 3 antiretroviral drugs combined in a fixed-dose combination. That means patients can take 1 tablet a day, very well-tolerated, potent therapy with a high barrier to resistance. And this has been another game changer and advance in antiretroviral therapy in low and middle income countries. And today, the complexity of antiretroviral therapy is much reduced because of this. That over 90% of patients on treatment in LMICs are on this fixed dose combination. So it really, the cornerstone of TLD is dolutegravir, a second generation integrase inhibitor, which has a plasma half-life of 14 hours, which means it can be dosed once a day. But one of its key factors is that even at the plasma half-life is 14 hours, the binding of the drug to the active site in the integrase enzyme is thought to be around 71 hours. And that is what contributes to its potency. But also it is a bit forgiving if the patients forget to take a dose, that they still get some coverage from it. And that's probably what helps in terms of its higher barrier to resistance as well, and generally very well tolerated. So our previous paradigm up to the years leading up to 2020 was that quite a complex approach to antiretroviral therapy. We would start patients on 2 NRTI drugs with efavirenz, We would monitor their viral load carefully. If they developed virological failure, we would switch them to AZT3TC and lopinavir ritonavir, which has terrible GIT side effects. And if they failed that, they would, if they had access to a resistance test, the resistance test was done. If they were resistant to the lopinavir, then they would get access to a third line with darunavir and with or without an integrase inhibitor. So it was a complex approach needing virological monitoring, a lot of knowledge about how to change therapy. But really things have been dramatically simplified because based on good clinical trials and programmatic evidence that I'll show you in the next slide, we've been able to shift to a new paradigm, which means that when patients start antiretroviral therapy, they can, most of them start on TLD unless they've got renal disease. We've been able to switch most patients who were on efavirenz to TLD, regardless of whether they're virologically suppressed or not. And even patients who were on PIs have mostly switched to TLD. And as I said, almost 90% or more, and up to 98% in some African countries of patients are on TLD. So there was good evidence to support this. Dolutegravir was shown to be superior to efavirenz-based regimen in the single trial and first-line therapy, largely because of tolerability factors. It was shown to be superior to lopinavir ritonavir in second-line therapy, again due to tolerability factors. And multiple trials have demonstrated the efficacy of TLD in second-line, even in the presence of resistance to tenofovir and 3TC. So that TLD combination, even if there's resistance to the T and the L, it's still the potency of dolutegravir carries it through. And this was demonstrated in the NADIA trial, DEF study, and the VISEN study, and the ARTIS study that we did in Khayelitsha in South Africa. And PEPFAR initiated transition from TLD for the majority of patients on ART in their programs in Africa in 2020. Some people thought that it was a risky approach because we didn't yet have all of this evidence, but they took a bold decision because of the potency of TLD, the tolerability, and also the cost associated with the drug, to say let's move everybody across. And I'll show you some slides of the impact of that in the next slide, because this is just showing you some data that was presented at the AIDS conference in 2022 from the CDC, US CDC, showing among PEPFAR-supported countries how the scale-up of TLD occurred from 2020 through to 2022. So 40% of patients were on TLD in the first period. By the last period, 87% were on TLD. And coincident with the introduction of TLD, you see that the proportion of patients suppressed with a viral load of less than 1,000 goes from the mid-80s to the mid-90s. So the shift from old regimens to TLD across the board led to this 10% improvement in virological suppression, and is an important factor that has allowed for a movement towards the 95 goals. One issue that you might be concerned about is, what about this widespread use of dolutegravir? If we're giving it to everybody, what about resistance to the drug? I've told you that it has a high barrier to resistance, but there's good data around this. In first-line dolutegravir with triple therapy, so when the drug is started in somebody's ART naive and it's combined with 2 NRTIs, it's extremely rare to develop resistance to dolutegravir. And I'll show you that that has not occurred in clinical trials and very rare in clinical practice. Second-line dolutegravir resistance does occur if there's a compromise to the 2 nukes that it's combined with. And in trials up to 3 years, about 1 to 3% of patients on second-line dolutegravir develop resistance. And there have been increasing reports from programs. And then there's a small group of patients who were exposed to drugs like riltegravir, first-generation integrase inhibitors, who are at higher risk of developing dolutegravir resistance. And this is just the data to support it, a meta-analysis of trials that have involved dolutegravir. And I've just highlighted 2. The first row is patients who started triple therapy with dolutegravir and were ART naive. And across 16 trials, not a single patient developed dolutegravir resistance. Whereas patients who are experienced and start, so they might have resistance to their 2 nucleosides, the risk of dolutegravir resistance in this meta-analysis is 1.5%. So dolutegravir resistance does occur in patients on second line, but almost never in patients on first line. So the new paradigm that we've moved towards, beyond our first, second line, and third line paradigm, and I was involved with the WHO in writing an opinion piece on this earlier this year, that we should move away from the terms first, second, and third line, because we really have the majority of patients on TLD. And what you've got to differentiate is those patients on TLD never having failed a regimen previously, because those patients have an extremely low risk of developing dolutegravir resistance. And if they develop viremia, it's likely due to adherence problems. Patients who have on TLD having previously failed a regimen, their risk of dolutegravir resistance is about 1 to 3%. And then there's a small group of patients who are on an alternative regimen because they can't tolerate, for instance, tenofovir due to renal problems. And then there's a group of patients who develop dolutegravir resistance that need an alternative regimen. So the consequences of widespread TLD use are that we can anticipate high levels of virological suppression, and the trial and programmatic data demonstrate that. But the minority of patients will develop dolutegravir resistance, and it's those that have previously failed a regimen. We need management algorithms to ensure resistance is detected in those patients when it occurs, while avoiding unnecessary costs of resistance tests. And so reliable measures of adherence like urine tenofovir tests would help us programmatically to select out those patients who are adhering and have a high viral load, and give access to resistance tests for those patients. And we need access to darunavir, because if patients fail dolutegravir, then we know that a darunavir regimen, even if the 2 nukes are compromised, will be effective from the NADIA study. So what are some of the key aspects of ART program success in Africa? I think I've just highlighted a few here. I think the fact that it's been delivered in primary care with task shifting to nurses. Many of the clinics are run by nurses, empowering the whole health system. The programmatic approaches with harmonized, standardized approaches in terms of guidelines, training, diagnostics, and drugs. The factors I've highlighted, that there's been continuous improvements in efficacy, safety, tolerability, and acceptability of antiretroviral therapy. The data systems for monitoring and informing scale-up, adherence counseling that has empowered patients, and policymakers that have been responsive to frontline healthcare workers. So to end off with, I just want to highlight what I think are some of the ongoing challenges that we face in the global HIV response. And I've put them down here: retention in care, advanced HIV disease, an ongoing burden of that, new infections, key populations that are disproportionately affected, and the funding cuts that have occurred this year. So in terms of retention in ART care, this is a major problem that we face in our program in South Africa. As I said, there's 6 million people on antiretroviral therapy. What we've come to learn is that if patients are on therapy for decades, that the majority of them will disengage from care at some point. It might be within 6 months, it might be after 10 years, but we can anticipate this is almost a normal event to occur. The patients will disengage, and interrupting antiretroviral therapy is something that occurs. Some patients cycle in and out of care, and those interruptions are associated with a risk of opportunistic infections and death, because the CD4 count drops, as I'll show you. And we need new models of care to address this. And these have been innovated, like adherence clubs, where people living with HIV come together to support one another, dispensing outside of healthcare facilities, and multi-month dispensing to make it easier for patients. And this is just some data that was published last year from the Western Cape province in South Africa, where they showed that among the 500,000 people living with HIV in this province, at any given point in time, a quarter of those people are disengaged from antiretroviral therapy. Those are people that have previously been on ART but now disengaged. So it's a substantial proportion of people with HIV are disengaged at any point in time. And this is just a figure from that paper, just showing that patients are disengaging at multiple time points: before starting ARVs, early during ARVs, and late during ARVs, and they're returning to care, some of them returning extremely ill, requiring hospitalization and having fatal outcomes. And this was a nice meta-analysis or systematic review that looked at the factors that contribute to disengagement, and they across publications highlighted the factors, the individual factors like psychological problems, interpersonal factors like stigma, healthcare systems factors like the long waiting times, the inflexibility of healthcare services, and then it's structural factors like work commitments. But it's often a proximal event, like an unexpected life event, that leads patients to disengage. And this is a point that I made, but I just want to stress it for clinicians, because I don't think many people, certainly in my country, or many clinicians are aware of this, that when a patient stops antiretroviral therapy, even if their CD4 count has gone up on antiretrovirals, so it went up from 100 to 500, when they stop ARVs, within a few months, it crashes back down again to what their CD4 NATO was. And this is some data that reflects that from this, the SMART study that was done in the 2000s, which they did something that is no longer, that they disproved is a good strategy, interrupted antiretroviral therapy and monitored patients to see whether that would improve outcomes. And they showed that it worsened outcomes. And this is just the data on the CD4 count, that there was a precipitous drop of CD4 count by around 200 cells within 4 months of interrupting antiretroviral therapy. So that's an important lesson for clinicians as well as patients, particularly those who started ART with a low CD4 count, that the CD4 count can crash after interrupting antiretroviral therapy. Patients can get opportunistic infections within a few months, particularly if their CD4 count was low at the start. In terms of advanced HIV disease, this is the study across Africa, representing multiple countries across Africa, showed that advanced HIV disease has a prevalence of about 10%. So about 10% of people living with HIV in Africa have a CD4 count of less than 200. This was the definition used in this study. And in our own hospitals in Cape Town, what we've seen is that admissions with HIV-related conditions, despite the scale-up of ART, have remained, the proportion of people admitted to hospital has remained similar, with HIV has remained similar between 2013 and 2022. So although we've had this huge scale-up of ART, we still see lots of patients with cryptococcal meningitis, disseminated TB, pneumocystis pneumonia, and that's driven by that pool of people that are disengaging from care, but also the people who present for care late. The major deaths of major causes of deaths due to advanced HIV disease across the world, mainly in low and middle income country settings, are TB and bacterial infections, and some of the other causes listed there. And TB contributes to mortality in about 40% of people with HIV globally. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's a bit higher. The WHO realized this was a major issue, an ongoing issue, advanced HIV disease, and needed specific packages of care to address it. And this was a package of care for advanced HIV disease developed in 2017 that's been integrated into the consolidated guidelines and involves routinely screening for opportunistic infections in patients entering care with low CD4 counts, including screening for cryptococcal infection and TB, prophylaxis against opportunistic infections with cotrimoxazole and TB preventive therapy, and then rapid ART initiation unless there's concern around meningitis and adherence support. And I just wanted to say that, that probably the two major killers of people with advanced HIV disease globally are tuberculosis, as I mentioned, but also severe bacterial infections. And, among those severe bacterial infections are, the documented evidence suggests that pneumococcus, salmonella, and other gram-negative bacteria are the major causes. The major limitations in terms of diagnostics and surveillance in many low and middle income settings. And one of the approaches for addressing this that was tested in the reality trial was a package of care for people with advanced HIV disease. So the reality trial was conducted in several African countries, enrolled patients with CD4 count of less than 100, and involved a package of care including cotrimoxazole, fluconazole, isoniazid, but also azithromycin for 5 days. And they showed that with that package of care, reduced mortality by around about 27%, 24-week mortality. But the azithromycin was not introduced in the WHO package of care because there was not standalone evidence for azithromycin. And we're addressing this in a trial that we're currently conducting at the University of Cape Town in collaboration with the PHRI in Canada, in the REVIVE trial funded by the Gates Foundation. And this is a massive multi-center, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. We target to enroll 8,000 patients who are presenting or representing for HIV care with a CD4 count of less than 100. And the randomization is to azithromycin for 4 weeks or placebo for 4 weeks. And then primary endpoint is mortality at 6 months. And the hypothesis is that by giving patients azithromycin for the first 4 weeks of antiretroviral therapy, we will reduce mortality due to severe bacterial infections. And so this trial is being conducted currently across 11 countries in Africa, highlighted in green, and 56 sites. We've enrolled close on 4,200 of the 8,000 patients, and we hope to continue complete enrollment by early next year, with results by the end of next year. Sorry, I shouldn't say next year. End of 2027, to finish enrollment by early 2027 and complete have the results by late 2027. So then, in terms of the other challenge that we still face, is new HIV infections. So I've told you that there are 1.3 million people newly infected with HIV globally. About half those people live in sub-Saharan Africa, and young women are still the portion of the population that is most severely affected by new infections. Outside sub-Saharan Africa, it's key populations and their sexual partners that account for 2/3 of new HIV acquisitions, and gay men and other MSM around 1/3. And this is just some data from the latest UNAIDS report that was released this week, just showing data from outside sub-Saharan Africa, showing that key populations in 2024 accounted for 2/3 of new infections, and the remaining population 1/3. The final issue that I wanted, the second last issue that I want to deal with, is the issue of the funding cuts. And this has clearly been the most significant issue for the global HIV community this year, with the Trump administration coming into power in the United States in January, and really introducing huge uncertainties and enormous cuts in the HIV funding that were dramatic and sudden and cruel in their nature. Obviously, the concern was that all US government funding would be cut. And that has not happened at this stage, but there's still major uncertainties. And this modeling study that was published in the UNAIDS report this week shows that if all US government funding is cut, what we can expect in the orange lines there is a reversal of what has been achieved over the last 3 decades. That new HIV infections will rise to about 2.5 million a year, and that HIV-related deaths will go up again to over 2 million a year. Now, the particular threat is to key population funding and to prevention interventions. And we've seen huge cuts to PrEP funding across many countries that are supported by PEPFAR funding. Obviously, the worst case scenario has not yet occurred. And if one looks at the PEPFAR budget, this is from the Chaya report that was published this week, there's still 2/3 of the funding is confirmed. It's clear that about a quarter has been cut, and about 11% is still uncertain. So we haven't yet experienced the worst case scenario, but there's still huge uncertainty, and certain aspects of the program have clearly been cut and targeted. Things like counseling support, support for data capture, and so we'd have less reliable data, as well as prevention interventions and funding for key populations. And that's going to have a dramatic effect in terms of scaling back the advances that we've had. And this is just from 10 countries where CHAI has looked at the effect of the budget cuts on country programs. And you can see access to oral prep reduced by around 40%. Also, it effects on the ART program in terms of patients starting ART and disengagements increasing. So the last issue that I want to deal with is how are we going to tackle the ongoing incidence of HIV, the 1.3 million and perhaps more infections that are occurring each year. In terms of HIV vaccine research, this has been a huge field of scientific activity, but to date, all HIV vaccine trials have failed. In terms of PrEP, there was a major breakthrough in terms of oral PrEP with tenofovir FTC, licensed by the FDA in 2012, has good efficacy in MSM and heterosexual couples in meta-analyses, but because of adherence challenges, has a limited efficacy for young cisgender women in Africa. Obviously, it's another advance was the availability of 2-monthly cabotegravir that showed in the HPTN studies that lowered the risk of HIV compared to oral PrEP by 66% and 88%. But the huge breakthrough that occurred in the last 2 years has been the scientific evidence around subcutaneous lenacapavir. So lenacapavir is a drug in a novel class. When I was speaking about the classes of HIV therapy earlier, I didn't mention this because it's a new class that and lenacapavir is the first drug in that class of capsid inhibitors. So the HIV capsid is within that surrounds the genome of HIV, the RNA genome, and once HIV enters the cell, it opens up, and then the HIV is able to enter the nucleus and be reverse transcribed and integrated. And what integrase inhibitors is that prevent both the uncoating of the capsid as well as the formation of the new capsid and are potent at suppressing HIV replication. And the other feature of lenacapavir is it's long-acting, so it can be given once every 6 months or subcutaneously or once a week orally. And in this Purpose 1 trial, a really remarkable finding. So this trial involved giving 6-monthly subcutaneous lenacapavir compared to placebo to adolescent girls and young women in South Africa and Uganda. Over 5,000 participants were enrolled, young women who were HIV negative, and the trial was stopped early by the Data and Safety Data Monitoring Committee because of the overwhelming evidence of efficacy. So there were 55 infections during the trial. None of the infections occurred in young women on lenacapavir. And you can see in the graph, it shows you compared to the background incidence that was estimated using recency assays when when participants entered the trial. That's the incidence of 2%. In participants on oral PrEP, also around 2% incidence, but 0 infections on lenacapavir. So 100% protection from HIV infection in this trial. And, you know, the key question for the field is now, how quickly can we scale up and make lenacapavir accessible? And some really exciting news that came out in the last month or two is the partnership between the Clinton Health Access Initiative, UnitAid, Dr. Reddy's laboratory in India, and WITS RHI to scale up lenacapavir at a cost of $40 per year, which is much lower than the thousands of dollars that it's available for in the US. But really, for this to be achieved, we need ongoing funding from the international community. And the fear is that the US funding cuts will severely affect our ability to scale this up. And some data suggests that to really achieve the promise of lenacapavir, this 100% protection, we would need to start tens of millions of people on lenacapavir in low and middle income countries to achieve full protection and help us end the epidemic. So final reflections. What I've shown you is that, you know, this 4 decades of HIV has really starkly highlighted global health inequities. But also the response has shown the huge value of global solidarity in addressing diseases of poverty. The response has been a remarkable public health achievement enabled by cost reductions in ART. I told you earlier that ART in 2000 cost $10,000 a year. Generic drugs now cost $45 a year. At least that's the South African price that the government pays. There's been global solidarity in funding. The public health approach coordinated by the WHO has enabled the in-country response and the scientific advances that I've spoken to. And recent scientific breakthroughs have provided prevention and treatment tools that could enable us to end HIV as a public health crisis. The scale-up of TLD has been transformational. I haven't spoken about long-acting treatment options, but I have spoken about the remarkable scientific breakthrough with subcutaneous lenacapavir. And what we need going forward is political commitment globally, within countries affected by HIV, but support from high-income countries, financing, access and health system delivery that are required to realize the promise of these tools that we have. And obviously the catastrophic withdrawal of US funding could undermine many of the advances that we've experienced. So just finally to end off and say gratitude to mentors and colleagues and students and patients from who I have personally learned. And thanks once again to CMC for the honor of delivering this oration, and thank you for your attention. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Menkes, for that illuminating and thought-provoking oration. Your work reminds us that pursuit of knowledge in medicine must always remain anchored to the communities we serve, particularly those most vulnerable. Now I invite Dr. Audrey Lennon, who is an Associate Professor, Department of Medicine, to present the commemorative plaque and read the citation honoring Professor Menkes.
The citation in honor of pioneering contribution in infectious disease awarded to Professor Graham Menton for his unswerving commitment to furthering the practices of infectious diseases in socially relevant context in developing countries. We, the faculty of Department of Internal Medicine and Infectious Diseases at Christian Medical College, Vellore, are privileged and honored to award Distinguished Professor Graham Mentis with the 14th Professor Benjamin M. PULIMOOD Oration in the Journey on HIV and ART in LMICs. The Professor Benjamin M. PULIMOOD Endowment Oration was established in 1995 to honor an inspiring teacher, a compassionate physician, and an extraordinary human being who has influenced thousands of undergraduates and postgraduates with his strength of character, principles, and morals apart from his legendary clinical skills. His emphasis on cost-effective care and ensuring treatment for each according to their need, whether emotional or social, has influenced the practice of internal medicine by many undergraduates, postgraduates, and peers. Christian Medical College, Vellore, salutes this pursuit of academic excellence in response to a vision fulfilling unmet needs of disadvantaged communities in the tropics through innovations in education, research, and training in infectious diseases by Professor Graham Mentis and Professor Benjamin M. PULIMOOD.
As we draw this program to a close, I invite Dr. Selvin, Associate Professor, Department of Infectious Diseases, to offer the concluding remarks and vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. As we have up to the end of this program, this evening stands a testament to scholarly excellence, and our shared commitment to advanced medical sciences, reflecting the values that shaped the legacy of Professor Benjamin Pulimood throughout his distinguished career. We are deeply grateful to Professor Grimes for graciously accepting our invitation and traveling all the way to be with us today. His presence and insights have greatly enriched this occasion, and we are honored to have you, sir. We extend our sincere appreciation to our institution's leadership and to the Department of Internal Medicine and Department of Infectious Diseases for the stewardship of this endowment. I'm grateful to all who contributed to the planning and success of this program. Finally, we would like to thank our colleagues, students, and guests, especially the students who are attending 17th International Short Course in Clinical Tropical Medicine, for your presence and engagement. We look forward to continued collaboration and the future collaborations and opportunities that strengthen our shared commitment to academic partnership and research excellence. With that, we conclude today's program. We invite everyone to join us for a tea break and snacks, which will be served in the lobby. Thank you.